He was just a butler, a quiet presence in a house too large for one man. Elliot Maddox never expected anything more from him. But that night, when he decided to follow Noah Reyes through the shadows of Austin's back streets, he wasn't chasing a lie. He was about to walk into a truth he never thought he'd find again. And in doing so, he would discover the boy he used to be, the one he buried under wealth, silence, and walls far thicker than brick. Elliot Maddox lived in silence. The kind of silence only billionaires seem to afford, a cold, echoing hush that filled the corners of his luxury estate in Austin, Texas. After years building an empire in financial technology, he'd learned to trade trust for control. Trust had cost him everything once: a lover who stole his ideas, sold his name, and left behind headlines he still couldn't read without flinching. So when he hired Noah Reyes as his personal butler, the quietness was what sold him. Noah didn't ask questions, didn't make small talk. He appeared on time, vanished just as quickly, and worked with the quiet precision of someone who knew how not to be noticed. He was Latino, young, barely in his 20s, and careful. He never stayed late unless asked, and every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, he requested to leave an hour early. Elliot didn't care at first, but patterns have a way of creeping under skin, especially when they refuse to break. Noah never used credit cards. He withdrew cash from his weekly paychecks several times. Elliot saw receipts for wire transfers made to an address that didn't match his family name. One night, Elliot found a pharmacy bag tucked into Noah's jacket pocket, with nothing but children's fever medication inside. It wasn't suspicion that drove Elliot to follow him. It was something quieter, like a question he didn't have the courage to ask. That Friday, Elliot instructed the driver to take the night off. He changed into dark clothes, slipped into the black SUV parked behind the garage, and waited until Noah exited through the staff door. At first, Noah walked as he always did, shoulders low, steps careful. But instead of calling a ride or walking toward the busier streets of downtown, he cut through an alley, crossed under an overpass, and disappeared behind a line of boarded-up shops. Elliot followed from a distance. Noah entered a dilapidated two-story house with broken steps and a roof patched with tarp. There was no sign, no lights from the outside, just a flickering bulb above the porch and a paper taped to the door. Elliot couldn't read it from the car. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest, keeping his head low. Through a smudged window near the back, Elliot saw something that stopped him cold. Noah stood in the center of a dimly lit room, cradling a gallon of milk in one arm and a stack of paper bowls in the other. Around him, scattered on thin mats and worn-out cushions, were teenagers, some huddled in corners, others laughing softly, clutching instant noodles or cups of hot cocoa. One boy wore a rainbow flag like a blanket. A girl braided another's hair while humming. There were no parents, no adults, just Noah moving like someone who had memorized each face, each name. Then Elliot saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 16, frail, curled up on a broken sofa with a hoodie pulled tight over his head. When Noah kneeled beside him, the boy flinched but didn't pull away. Noah whispered something, and the boy's shoulders slowly dropped. He leaned forward and hugged him. Not for long. Just enough. Elliot felt a sharp ache in his chest. He remembered eyes like that, eyes too tired for their age, eyes that used to belong to him long ago, in a home where love had conditions. He stood outside that house long after the last light dimmed, his hand resting on the cold metal gate, unsure whether to knock or to run. But he didn't run, because in that moment, he realized something terrifying. Maybe Noah wasn't the one hiding something. Maybe Elliot was the one who had forgotten how to see. And maybe the reason the silence in his mansion felt so loud was because all the voices that mattered had never been allowed inside. Follow Heartstorie for the next part of this journey, where secrets unfold not in boardrooms, but in back alleys, and where the quietest people hold the loudest truths. Years before Elliot Maddox became a billionaire, he had been just another terrified teenager with nowhere to go. The memory was buried now, somewhere beneath the weight of board meetings and portfolio updates. But it stirred that night as he drove back from the shelter alone, quiet, shaken. His childhood was a room locked tight. He had grown up in a family where expectations were loud, but compassion was silent. When he came out at 17, the silence broke, but not in the way he had hoped. His father didn't scream. He didn't throw him out with a suitcase or hit him. He simply stopped speaking to him altogether. His mother offered a blanket apology before quietly slipping a check into his coat pocket the night he left. That was the last time he saw her. Elliot had survived by turning silence into armor. He pushed through college on scholarships and hunger, building a tech company in his early 20s with nothing but code, caffeine, and an unwillingness to fail. But after being betrayed by the man he once trusted most, a former partner who leaked his innovations and nearly tanked his startup, Elliot decided never to let anyone in again. People were risky. Distance was safe. So when Noah Reyes had first walked through the doors of his mansion, Elliot saw nothing more than a functional hire. Young, respectful, discreet. Elliot didn't know where Noah went every Tuesday and Friday, and frankly, he hadn't cared. The boy kept the house running smoothly and didn't disturb his routines. That was enough. Until it wasn't. The man he saw at that shelter was not the same one who moved quietly through the marble floors of Elliot's home. There, under the cracked ceiling and worn furniture, Noah came alive. He didn't just serve hot food. He remembered names, medical needs, birthdays. He showed one teenager how to fill out a resume, another, how to boil ramen without burning the noodles. His voice was soft, but it carried his hands and steady, his smile unforced. Elliot hadn't smiled like that in years. It wasn't charity. What Noah was doing wasn't even legal. That shelter had no license, no government support. The building looked like it could collapse under strong wind. And yet it held more warmth than Elliot's mansion ever had. He remembered the way Noah hugged that trembling boy, how the others looked at him not with pity or dependency, but trust. Back home, Elliot walked through his halls as if seeing them for the first time. Polished, expensive, empty. In the kitchen, he noticed a piece of paper Noah had left behind, a grocery list. At the bottom, scribbled in uneven handwriting, was "Need more milk for Marcus." Marcus, the boy with the rainbow blanket. Elliot ran his thumb over the paper, tracing each word. This wasn't obligation. Noah wasn't paid for this. He was barely paid at all. Elliot sat in the kitchen well past midnight. The house was silent, but not in its usual way. This was a new silence, one that made space for questions. He remembered what it felt like to go to sleep wondering where your next meal would come from. He remembered counting coins for antibiotics. He remembered wearing extra socks in place of a coat. And he wondered how had he forgotten all of it for so long. Maybe success hadn't replaced his past. Maybe it had only buried it. Somewhere along the way, Elliot had convinced himself that surviving meant forgetting, that to move on, he had to look forward and never back. But now, watching a young man shoulder the pain of dozens with little more than a grocery list and a rented smile, he saw how wrong that was. Healing, he realized, doesn't come from turning away. It comes from remembering and choosing differently. And sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones still carrying what we've tried so hard to leave behind. Elliot Maddox didn't sleep that night. The light in his study stayed on until morning, as the paper with the words "Need more milk for Marcus" sat beside his laptop. Something had shifted, not loudly, not in anger or pity, just quietly, like a door unlocking that he hadn't realized was closed. He didn't confront Noah, didn't ask questions. He simply opened his bank app and scheduled a weekly delivery of groceries to an unlisted address. He registered it under a pseudonym and told the service to leave the boxes by the back door without knocking. A few days later, he contacted a former contractor, someone discreet, to patch the leaking roof of a house he didn't technically own. He paid double the rate and gave one instruction: no questions, no photos. It didn't stop there. He arranged a voucher for water and electric bills through a third party, anonymous donations to keep the lights on and the water running, a plumber to fix the bathroom, second-hand bunk beds delivered after hours, even a few tablets, wiped clean, with basic software for schoolwork and job searches. Noah never said a word about it, but Elliot saw it in the small ways. On Wednesday, the circles under his eyes were slightly lighter. On Thursday, the boy named Marcus wore a warmer hoodie to school, the same one Elliot had quietly added to the shipment. Back at the mansion, Elliot started seeing Noah differently. Not in a dramatic, movie scene way. It was subtler than that. He noticed how Noah always checked the fridge inventory before leaving, as if mentally planning something beyond his own kitchen. how he folded laundry faster when he was anxious, how his eyes lingered on the clock near the front entrance every Tuesday and Friday. One night, Elliot came down to the kitchen late for a glass of water. The room was dim, the marble countertops lit only by the stove light. There, resting his head on a stack of documents, was Noah sound asleep? His right hand still clutched a spreadsheet filled with scribbled margins and circled totals. At the top, Elliot read monthly intake versus emergency funds. The other hand gripped a pen without a cap. Beside him sat a half-eaten granola bar. Elliot didn't wake him. He stood there for a moment, realizing the absurdity. Here he was, a man who built software that predicted global financial trends, watching a 20-something manage a community on handwritten notes and expired snacks. Why did a boy that young carry the weight of so many? That question stayed with Elliot long after Noah stirred awake and shuffled off to bed without noticing him. The next day, Elliot called an old associate from his early philanthropy years. He asked whether the name Noah Reyes had ever appeared in their records. The answer came quickly. Noah was once one of the recipients of the Maddox LGBTQ Uplift Fund, a scholarship Elliot had launched in the early days of his company. Back then, it had been a publicity move, a press release, something to make investors feel proud. Elliot hadn't even reviewed the names on the acceptance list. He'd signed the checks, delegated the emails, and moved on. But Noah hadn't. In the following days, Elliot spent more time at his desk, reading through old letters, some handwritten, some typed, sent by students who had received his scholarship. Most were brief thanks, forgotten over time, but 3 stood out. They came from young people who'd used those funds not just to attend school, but to survive. One mentioned escaping abuse, another homelessness. One letter, unsigned, had a final line that haunted him. "You don't know me, but you gave me a ladder when I had nothing to climb with." Elliot remembered that line when he saw Noah again on Friday, buttoning his coat with that same urgency, eyes heavy but focused. He didn't speak, didn't hint at what awaited him beyond Elliot's gates, but Elliot knew, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own house, because now he could see what he hadn't been willing to before, that some people rebuild the world not by shouting, not by fighting, but by quietly showing up. Every Tuesday, every Friday, with a gallon of milk and an open heart, the invitation went out as routine. Elliot Maddox held a charity gala every spring, something to satisfy investors and sponsors who like to see a human side to their money. This year's theme was Hope Through Resilience. His team curated the nominations for community heroes and local nonprofits. Elliot let them. It was easier not to be involved in the emotional parts, until one name on the honoree list stopped him: Cold New Roots Youth Collective, for their dedication to marginalized LGBTQ+ teens. The address was the same as the one he'd traced that night in the SUV. The contact, Noah Reyes. Elliot didn't remove the name. He didn't say a word. But that evening, as guests in formal wear stepped onto champagne-colored carpets and violinists played at the entrance, Elliot stood near the stage, watching the doors. Noah arrived late. His tie was uneven. His jacket looked borrowed. And his hands trembled when he accepted the plaque from the host. But when he stood at the podium, something in his posture changed. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I never thought I'd speak in a place like this," he began, glancing out at the glittering crowd. "When I was younger, I lived in fear of being seen, of being abandoned, of waking up on the street again." A pause. His fingers tightened on the edge of the lectern. "But then someone gave me a scholarship. It paid for more than tuition. It paid for safety. It told me I mattered, even if I never met the person who believed in me. And now I try to do the same for kids who don't have anyone else." There was silence, then soft, sustained applause. But Elliot didn't clap. He couldn't move. That scholarship, the Maddox LGBTQ Uplift Fund, Elliot had created it during the early days of his company, before the IPO, before the betrayal. It had been his way of giving back to a community he didn't have the courage to be part of then. He didn't remember Noah's application, hadn't known, until now, that he'd been the recipient. The irony landed heavy. The boy Elliot hired to polish his silverware had once clung to his name like a life raft. When the gala ended, Elliot waited until they were alone in the car. The drive was quiet. Streetlights passed like questions with no answers. Back at the mansion, Elliot stepped into the foyer and turned toward Noah, who was folding his jacket carefully over one arm. "Why did you apply for this job?" Elliot asked. His voice was quieter than usual, unsure. Noah didn't speak right away. He looked down at the floor, then back up. "I didn't apply to be a butler," he said slowly. "I applied to stand beside someone who once gave me hope, even if he forgot." The words didn't sting. They settled, like dust on old memories. Elliot leaned against the banister, hands in his pockets, trying to steady a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. All those years, he had assumed his kindness had gone unnoticed, forgotten in the blur of mergers and betrayals. But Noah had remembered, not because he was trying to repay a debt, but because he understood something Elliot had long buried: that kindness, even when given thoughtlessly, can echo into someone's survival. It isn't always about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it's about being the one person who shows up when no one else does. And years later, it may be the only reason someone chooses to stay and to give that same gift forward. The offer came 3 days later. Elliot typed the letter himself, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't drafted by his legal team. No fancy header. No intimidating language. Just a direct invitation: "I would like to offer you the role of Director of Community Programs at the Maddox Foundation. You will have full autonomy to shape its mission, build your own team, and expand the work you've already started. The salary will match the weight you carry." Finally, he left the envelope on the kitchen counter where Noah would find it. That evening, Noah stood silently in front of Elliot's study, letter in hand, lips pressed together. The hallway light cast long shadows on the floor. "I don't know if I can do this," he said. Elliot looked up. "Why, I'm not a desk person," Noah admitted. "I'm afraid the further I sit from those kids, the less I'll remember how to help them." Elliot didn't argue. He simply nodded. "Then don't sit, build, and when you climb, let me be the one who holds the ladder." Noah didn't answer then, but he stayed a little longer that night, sitting across from Elliot in a silence that felt shared, not hollow. Weeks passed. The paperwork came through. The first checks were signed. And together, they secured the permits for a real building, a safe haven that wouldn't be hidden behind peeling wood and silence. They called it Marcus Shelter, named not for glory, but for memory. For the first child Noah ever pulled in from the cold. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was held on a cloudless morning in April. Sunlight poured across the courtyard, where dozens of folding chairs had been set up. Local officials were there, journalists, donors. But at the front row sat a boy who'd once trembled on a broken couch under a threadbare hoodie. Marcus stood tall now, 18, healthy, eyes clear. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward with a letter in hand. "My name is Marcus," he began. "I used to think people only cared when there was something to gain. But one night, someone brought me a blanket, a hot drink, and told me I wasn't broken. That someone was Noah." He paused, then looked at Elliot. But behind that shelter, behind Noah's strength, there was a man who never even realized the ladder he'd been holding. That man is Elliot Maddox. You gave us more than money. You gave us a place to be seen, to exist. And for some of us, that saved our lives. Elliot didn't cry easily. But that day, he did. The applause blurred. His eyes fixed on the boy he never knew he'd helped save. A boy who now stood not as a victim, but as a voice. Noah reached for his hand. Their fingers locked, brief, grounded, real. The crowd stood. The shutters clicked. But in that moment, Elliot wasn't a billionaire, or a donor, or a name on a plaque. He was just a man who had once survived, and finally remembered what it meant to lift someone else. Sometimes we think impact has to be loud, but often, it starts quietly in a forgotten scholarship. A blanket on a cold night. A hand that holds the ladder steady so someone else can rise. So now, let me ask you this. If someone gave you that ladder, would you climb it or would you turn around and hold it for the next person instead? Tell us in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, share it. Follow Heartstorie, and let's make sure stories like these never stay in the dark again.